On the 1st of May 2022, the receded shoreline of Lake Mead gave back a steel drum with a body inside. The reservoir had been falling for 20 years. 20 years. It is still falling. Between that morning in May and autumn of the same year, the new shoreline gave back at least 6 separate sets of human remains. 3 of the 6 have names now. 1 of them does not. How many more shorelines hold? How many more graves the institutions were not built to find? This is the Quiet Hill, Dutch down. This is the Quiet Hill. This is the lake that gave back. It's that the reservoir is called Lake Mead. It sits on the Nevada and Arizona border behind Hoover Dam, 30 miles southeast of Las Vegas. It is the largest reservoir in the United States. At full pool, it covers 247 square miles. The shoreline runs to about 750 miles. But it has not been at full pool in living memory. The body in the drum was a man with a gunshot wound to the head. 4 years on, he is still unidentified. Chapter 1. The Reservoir by Hoover Dam was authorized by the Boulder Canyon Project Act of December 19. It was built between 1931 and 1936. The reservoir behind it, filled for the first time across the late 1930s. At full pool, the surface of Lake Mead stands 1,229 feet above sea level. It last reached that elevation in 1983 after an unusual snowmelt year. Since the turn of the millennium, the lake has been falling more or less continuously. The decline is the consequence of a hydrology problem returned to the original allocation of the river. The Colorado River Compact was signed in 1922. It divided the river's flow between an upper basin and a lower basin. Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico in the upper, Nevada, Arizona, and California in the low. The treaty assumed the river's average annual flow at Lee Ferry was around 17.5 million acre-feet. The negotiators were working from a 30-year record that fell inside an unusually wet period. The long-run average is closer to 14 million acre-feet. The average since 2000 has been lower still. The river has been over-allocated by paper for a century and over-allocated by climate for more than 2 decades. The reservoirs absorb the gas, Dr. Gel. By 2000, Lake Mead stood at about 1,204 feet. By 2010, 1,112. By the summer of 2022, the lake bottomed at 1041 feet above sea level. It was the lowest reading since the reservoir was first filled. The white calcium carbonate deposit on the surrounding canyon walls rose nearly 200 feet above the new waterline. The United States Geological Survey and the Bureau of Reclamation were by then calling the period multi-decadal mega drought. As of June 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation's weekly report places Lake Mead at 1048. That is 29% of capacity. The Bureau projects further drop to 1040 feet in July. That would match the 2022 record, but the Bureau's 24-month study models a further low of 1011 feet. By May 2028, that pool, the elevation below which water can no longer flow through the Hoover Dam intakes is 895 feet. The drought is ongoing. It is in this falling water that on the afternoon of the 1st of May 2022, two boaters at Hemingway Harbor saw something on the new mud that did not look. Chapter 2, The Barrel. Hemingway Harbor sits on the Nevada shore of the Boulder Basin, the southernmost of Lake Mead's named basins, and at full pool, the water at its mouth is something close to 100 feet deep. As the lake fell across 2021 and into 22, the harbor floor receded. What had been 100 feet of water over silt was by late April mud at the new shoreline. The drum was a corroded 55-gallon steel drum of the kind once sold for industrial use across the American West. It was lying on its side on the new mud. The stop was open or had rusted out. The witnesses who found it on the afternoon of the 1st of May could see inside. There were human remains. Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department homicide detectives took the call. The forensic and homicide team that cataloged the contents over the following days included Lieutenant Ray Spencer of LVL Homicide. They had a male and adult with a gunshot wound to the head, consistent with execution at close range. Clothing, a shirt and trousers from a brand sold by Kmart, sneakers, a wristwatch, a belt. The clothing brand and style, the sneaker manufacturer, and the watch were all consistent with the period from roughly 1975. Sure. The drum itself was a method in the cultural shorthand of organized crime in the American West of that period. A body in a drum weighted dropped from a boat in the deep water of a calcium carbonate, silt, and zebra mussel incrustation would, over decades, weld the drum and its contents to the lake bed. Under the original assumptions of the 1970s hydrology, the drum would have stayed where it was put for as long as there was a Lake Mead. The detectives' working framework, stated in the days after the recovery and reiterated in every subsequent press conference, was that the case had the structural fingerprints of 1970s organized crime homicide. They did not, in any of the press conferences across 2022, 2023, or 2024, state that they had identified they have not done so since. The body in the barrel is, as of the spring of 2026, still officially unidentified. What grew up around the case, in the absence of an identification, was a particular nominee. The Mob Museum in downtown Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, retired Las Vegas FBI agents speaking on the record, and several national outlets. Johnny Papas, sometimes given in print, Johnny J. Papas, also a Chicago-born Las Vegas resident who, by the middle of the 1970s, was running the Echo Bay Marina on Lake Mead, Silverton Arm. Echo Bay was at the time a marina with reported organized crime connection. Papas was a casino host with industry contacts in the Chicago Outfits Las Vegas operation. In 1976, he disappeared. The account given by his widow to investigators was that her husband had told her, shortly before he vanished, that an attempt had been made to force his car off the road. The other element of the family narrative is that, before he disappeared, Papas had been considering cooperating with federal investigators. The natural inference, made in print, but never confirmed in any official document, is that the Chicago Outfits Las Vegas enforcer, or one of his crew, may have been the executioner. None of this rises in any official statement to the level of an identification. Lieutenant Ray Spencer told KSNB News 3 in 2025, 3 years on, that the case remained unsolved. The Johnny Papas theory is the leading public hypothesis, which is not the official one. Chapter 3, the second body. On Saturday, the 7th of May 2022, two sisters were paddleboarding off Calville Bay. It was 6 days after the barrel. Calville Bay sits about 30 miles northeast of Hemingway Harbor on the Lake Mead shoreline. On a second look, what one of them had taken for a rock at the waterline was skeletal remains. National Park Service rangers at Lake Mead National Recreation Area responded just after 2 in the afternoon. They worked with the Clark County Coroner's Office through the evening to recover what they could before the light went. The remains were partial, portion of a skeleton, not a complete body. Las Vegas Metro initially did not respond as a homicide. The framing released that night was that homicide investigators were not being called in. The case would be handled by the coroner. The initial coroner's profile was guarded about sex and estimated an age range of roughly 23 to 30. On the 24th of August 2022, the office announced that remains had been identified. They belonged to Thomas Erndt, a Las Vegas resident, aged 42 at the time of his death. Erndt had drowned at Lake Mead on the 2nd of August, the 2nd of 2, almost 20 years should the day before his remains were recovered. The drowning had been a family event. Erndt had taken his 2 children, his sister, and another adult out on a boat from Calville Bay on the evening of Friday, the 2nd of August. Late in the evening in dark water, Erndt removed his shirt and jumped in. He did not surface. The wind was rising, the lake was choppy, the boat motor would not start, the cellular signal was poor. By the time National Park Service search and rescue assets reached the family, Erndt was gone. His body was never found. 2002. His son, Tom, who was 10 years old at the time and on the boat, said later in local television interviews that he had assumed at first that his father was joking, hiding under the boat. The recognition over the next minutes that he was not and had stayed with him for the next 20 years. The August 2022 identification gave his family, for the first time in 2 decades, a remains they could bury. The water level had dropped through the elevation at which a known unrecovered drowning victim was suspended in sediment. The receding shoreline was producing not so much new mysteries as the visible end of old ones. Chapter 4, the third body, the sun, they say. On the 25th of July 2022, 11 weeks after the second body, a park visitor walked the exposed beach near the Boulder Beach swimming area. On the new sand at the Boulder Basin shoreline, the visitor saw skeletal remains. National Park Service rangers and the Clark County Coroner's Office recovered what was there. On the 6th of August, in the same general area, a second visitor saw more remains. On the 16th of August, within the perimeter of the same general site, a third set was found. The Clark County Coroner's Office, working over the following months, established by genetic profiling and by physical reassembly, that all 3 sets belonged to a single individual. The body had been deposited or had come to rest at this location and had been redistributed across the shoreline by wave action. In late April 2023, the office announced the identification. Claude Russell Pensinger of Las Vegas. He had been 52 years old when he disappeared from Lake Mead on the 14th of July 1990. Pensinger had been a Navy and Coast Guard veteran. He had gone fishing on the Nevada side of the reservoir in a small boat with his brother, who was fishing nearby in a separate boat. The brothers had planned to meet later in the day at an agreed point on the lake. Claude Pensinger did not arrive. His boat was found shortly afterward, running in circles on the water under its own power, with no one aboard. He was described by his brother to investigators as a strong swimmer. No body was recovered in 1998 or in 1999. or in any of the 24 intervening years, until the bones came up Boulder Beach shoreline in the summer of the Chapter 5, the fourth body, on Monday, the 17th of October, 2022. Contractors working at the Calville Bay Marina found a skeleton near their work area. They had been performing engineering work on a structure that the falling water had made newly accessible. On the 19th of October, additional remains were found in the same general location. On a coroner's review, they were determined to belong to the same individual. In the closing months of 2022, the coroner's office identified the Donald P. Smith of North Las Vegas, aged 39, at the time of his reported drowning in April 1974. The cause of death was determined to be drowning. The manner of death, accidental. Smith had been underwater for 48 years. The case extended the temporal range of the discoveries. Erndt was a 2002 recreational drowning, 20 years in the water, Dutchman. Pensinger was a 1998 angling accident, 24 years in the water. Smith was a 1974 drowning, 48 years in the water. The lake had been a quiet archive across a half-century of recreational and accidental losses. The receding shoreline was now producing them in intake mixture. Chapter 6. What else the drought revealed? The same drought that produced the inhuman remains produced two other discoveries. Neither is a body. Both belong in the same way the human remains do to the lake. The first is the Lake Mead B-29, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress that crashed into the lake on the 21st of July, 1948. It had been flying a then classified high altitude atmospheric research mission. The pilot misjudged his altitude over a mirror smooth lake surface, struck the water at 230 miles per hour. The 5-man crew launched a life raft. They were recovered from the lake 6 hours later. The wreck stayed at the bottom of the Overton Arm for 53 years. In 2001, private dive team located it with side-scan sonar. The National Park Service has since managed the site as a cultural resource. The dive permit has been closed since 2022 for preservation. The second is St. Thomas, Nevada, Coda, a Mormon farming settlement founded in 1865 by 45 families. By the early 20th century, it had a population of around 500, a school, a post office, a general store, a hotel. When President Coolidge signed the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928, the residents of St. Thomas learned that their town would be flooded by the new. By 1938, Lake Mead had risen to the floor of the last house. The town's final resident was a man named Hugh Lord, he woke on the morning of the 11th of June 1938 to find lake water lapping at his bed. He loaded what he could into a rowboat, set his house on fire, and rowed out. St. Thomas stayed under 60 feet of water until the drought of the early 2000s began to expose its foundations again. The town cemetery was relocated to Overton ahead of the flooding in the 1930s. The relocation was not necessarily comprehensive by modern forensic standards. Some of what the lake covered when it filled, the lake gave back when it fell. Chapter 7, the forensic pipeline. The lead investigative body on every set of remains found on the Nevada side of the lake is the Clark County Office of the Coroner and the Medical Examiner. Across this period, it has been headed by Coroner Melanie Rouse. The office operates with the bandwidth of a county and medical examiner, serving the Las Vegas metropolitan area. About 2.25 million residents, plus a substantial transient and tourist population, plus everything that washes up on the shoreline of the country's largest reservoir. The office is not staffed to run a systematic shoreline survey. Its workflow is reactive. When remains are reported by a member of the public, rangers respond, the coroner's investigators respond, and the case enters a queue for identification. Althram Inc., the private forensic genetic genealogy laboratory founded in 2018 in the Woodlands, Texas, as being the contracted DNA specialist on the Barrow case. Althram's role is to extract usable DNA from skeletal remains, build the forensic genome, and walk it back through cousin matching in a consumer genealogy database toward the lab's funding for the work came in part from the Vegas Justice League, a privately financed nonprofit set up by the Vegas philanthropist Justin Wu. In November 2023, the Clark County Coroner's Office, Las Vegas Metro, released a facial approximation, a forensic artist's reconstruction of the man's likely appearance in life, circulated through national media. No identification followed. The pipeline that makes such identifications in 2026 is 6 years old. The technique that pulls usable DNA from 45 to 50-year-old skeletal remains is a man buried in the lake before the technology to identify him was invented, identified by a technology in its first decade of operation. That is what the case turns on. Chapter 8, the institutional problem on Lake Mead National Recreation Area is administered by the National Park Service. Its shoreline at full pool runs to about 750 miles. The vertical drop from the historical full pool elevation to the present elevation is something close to 180 feet. The horizontal exposure of new shoreline in the flatter basins around Boulder Beach, Calville Bay, and the Overton Arm runs to hundreds of feet. The lake has exposed many tens of square miles of lake bed that had been continuously underwater for between 50 and 90 years. There is no systematic survey of any of this. Discoveries are made by the public, reported to rangers, and investigated reactively. There has been no announcement across 2022 through 2026 of a National Park Service or county initiative to walk to ensure search pattern. There is no published estimate of how many additional remains of what age are likely to be exposed at projected future lake elevation. Chapter 9, modeled forward. Let's see, the Bureau of Reclamation publishes its weekly elevations and its 24-month projections. Bureau hydrologists model future water levels at 1 foot resolution. No equivalent forensic projection is being produced. The current elevation is 1048.47 feet. Coda in case Lake Mead lost a third of its water and gave back bodies it had been keeping for decades. Some of those bodies names now. Thomas Erndt, identified in 2022, drowned in 2002. Claude Russell Pensinger, identified in 2023, missing since 1998. Donald B. Smith, identified in 2022, drowned in April of 1974. One of them is still in a steel barrel, still unidentified, still presumed murdered in the 1970s. The question is not who that man is. The question is how many more shorelines hold, how many more graves the institutions were not built to find. If the case stays with you, subscribe. There will be more. Until then, keep them in mind. The ones the lake has given back and the ones it has not.